speaking through Paul to us about in this particular chapter. This story is a little bit long and a little bit involved, but I believe it gives a backdrop for what's the major theme and thought for us today. So bear with me with it and let's see what it might set up for us. My title for the lesson today is a little bit misleading in the sense that I'm not going to speak about cremation or in-ground burial, but I think when we are buried, what do we want to be the reminder to people around us, and what will be the major story of our lives. We all leave a story. That story can be changed over our life. It can be modified, but we all leave a story of some kind to others that are around them that know us, and even some that don't know us but hear that story. So we'll be talking a little bit about that over the next 2 weeks. So let me go on with the story. A friend in ministry of mine once told me a story, and it's supposedly a true story, about a couple that he had known. They showed up at his office in his church one day. He hadn't seen them for about 5 years, and they had been a part of a prior ministry where he had served as a pastor. And he said Jim and Linda had come to know Jesus Christ out in California, and then they'd moved to the Midwest and settled in his town and began attending his church. Before coming to Christ, Jim had been somewhat of a hellraiser. He was a great, big, burly guy, full of a lot of energy and strength of character. But once Jesus Christ had gotten a hold of his life, he began to straighten out his life as only Christ can do in a life. And he and his wife and 4 kids became a part of my friend's church. And immediately Jim threw himself into ministry. By the way, my voice is starting up again. I see an ENT sometime when they tell me when, and they're going to drop a tube down and say, ah. And last time I almost kicked the poor woman to death. Yeah. But we'll see how that works. Anyway, Jim threw himself also not only in his ministry, but into business there in the Midwest, all kinds of businesses, from owning a stoneworks business to sales to bus bench, advertising to owning a restaurant. He was a diversified guy and a very talented guy, and all of these business ventures were successful. They were all going concerns, and they came to my friend's church, and with servants' hearts and servant attitudes, willing to serve almost anywhere, doing almost anything that could be asked of them. And they were the kind of people that worked hard to try to provide the best for their kids and for their future, and they were successful. They were living the American dream, and they had Jesus Christ besides that, so things were good, you know. And fast forward that a bit, my pastor friend had moved on from there, moved from the church that he was at, and lo and behold, about 5 years after he had last seen them, the same couple came walking in to his new church. And one afternoon in the middle of the week, and they said to, my friend said to Jim, hey, it's great to see you. What are you doing these days? Expecting a report, I imagine, that they had started another 4 or 5 different businesses and everything was going great. But immediately, Jim replied, we've become missionaries. And my friend thought to himself, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I need to find out more. And they went on to say, we've become boarding parents to 37 at-risk high schoolers in a Christian school in Oklahoma. And the Lord had opened up a prison ministry for them in that town. They could be involved in as well, and we've never been happier in our entire life. Jim went on to share that they were now living on less than $6,000 a year with 4 kids. In fact, one month their missionary support check came in and it was $16.
Whoa.
And yet they said they knew they were right where God wanted them to be. My pastor friend asked him, how did this happen? You had it all going for you, you know, a great community, great jobs, private Christian schools. What changed? And Jim replied, well, let me tell you, it started about 3 years ago. Our 16-year-old daughter had been thinking about and praying about a short-term mission trip to Egypt. And all of our friends were counseling us at that time, so Jim said that you got to be crazy to let your daughter go to the Middle East at this time. It's so unstable. You guys shouldn't do that. But Jim said they decided to do so, and so they let her go. And so she went, and worked in the heat and the poverty and the struggle of that nation, ministering there to the poor. And one night, the mission team was gathered together in a home, and they were praying. And that evening, the home was surrounded by fanatical Islamists with torches and guns and swords, who made their intention very, very vocal and very clear that they intended to slaughter all of the infidels in that house. The team was trapped inside, and so all they could do was pray all night long. And he said, in his mercy, God spared their lives, and Jim said, my daughter came back a changed girl as a result of that experience. And he said, and so when she returned home and we got back to our normal routine, she began to ask us questions, difficult questions. Like, Dad, why are you working so hard for money and for stuff? Why are you accumulating all of these things around you? Well, Jim said, I told her, well, honey, I'm doing it for you. I'm working hard trying to build up a business for you and your brothers to take over someday. I'm trying to provide for you guys to make sure you have the best, that you can go to good schools. All sounds reasonable, doesn't it? And all she could say was, Dad, are you sure that's what Jesus wants you to be doing with your life? Mm-hmm. Aren't there more important things that you could be giving yourself to? And Jim said from that moment, God began working on our hearts and telling us that he wanted us to put everything on the line for him. And so here we are, missionaries, serving Jesus in Oklahoma. Now, if that's for me, I'm not here.
They found your glasses. They're in your pocket.
Yeah, they're in your pocket.
These are 4-year-old glasses that are to fall back. You really become blurry.
Windows not that way.
Yeah. Well, some of you, yeah, that's true.
Hey, don't talk about Bill.
I wasn't going to use them.
Don't talk about Bill.
Okay. Now, I don't know how that true story may strike you, but I would dare to say that most of us here who are married and who have families can resonate with the priority and I think the desire to provide the best that we can for our families. We want to surround them with spiritual privileges and protections and good things and all of the reasonable comforts of life that we can afford to put in place. I remember many times as I would work the 9 to 5 and then go on and work another job from 6:30 to midnight and back up at 6, and you all have been there doing that. And I would always say, I'm doing this for you. Always. So we think that if we can simply make everything comfortable and readily accessible and spiritually non-threatening and just normal, that everything and everyone ought to turn out just fine, right? We provide for our kids, and then sometimes those kids don't do right. How many of you have said, well, my goodness, I give them everything. I've sent them to Christian school. I've raised them up in the church. They've been a blessing in our house. What happened? I'm sure you've never said that. I have. I think that we as a Christian culture sort of have bought into the idea that the greater the amount of comfortable spiritual privileges and provisions, the greater the spiritual growth. The greater the amount of comfortable spiritual privileges and provisions, the greater the spiritual growth. And yet when you take a hard look at real life evidence for that sort of philosophical maxim, it sort of rings a bit hollow and self-absorbed a little bit.
Well, I think it's probably a little bit backwards, because when you're comfortable, you don't tend to rely on God. You think you're all good and all set, and you really don't need that.
It's true.
I think that's certainly very true. Very true.
Because the girl in your story, it's when she was uncomfortable is when the light bulb went on for her. She wasn't in her dad's privileged world with all the money, and she was in a place where only God could save her.
Yeah, I do certainly think that's true, but I also think that we have bought into the idea that our providing these spiritual privileges, if you will, is enough. I took you to church. Absorb it.
Yeah.
You've seen me say grace over dinner, so absorb it. And that will be sufficient. And I think this is, the Apostle Paul is used by the Spirit of God to really teach us the truth. And here is the big idea to this. And I think we need to focus on it very, very deeply. That spiritual privilege alone is no guarantee of spiritual growth. Why? Because it has to be coupled with spiritual discernment of what is really important individually. My son, my daughter may have been raised in a Christian home and been baptized and presumably received Christ and lived in this environment of Christian privilege, if you will, but did not discern individually, personally, what is spiritually important for themselves. You know, there's an old saying, God has no grandchildren. You understand that? Everybody must be born again, individually. And they can't go far, and they certainly cannot go to heaven on my spiritual faith. It must be individualized. There must be that spiritual discernment about what's important. That's why some of our kids and some of the people that you know are not safe, because they have tried to live on that spiritual privilege that was provided, but did not discern for themselves personally what was important, and made those decisions that each individual must make. Does that make sense to you? Good, because I couldn't repeat that.
That's all right, I got it on tape.
You got it on tape, praise God.
We can just play it back.
Let me hear it later. Yeah.
You know, and the bad thing about that is the children and everything are in the world more than they are at home. In the world, and even in school, and some of the Christian schools, quote.
Well, I know
So that makes it tough on us.
we had a Christian school at our home church, Calvary Road Baptist Church in Northern Virginia. And we had a Christian school there, about 240 students. It wasn't a large one, but not a tiny one. But a gentleman came into the office one day, and he's had a lot of trouble with a rebellious daughter. And he blamed us, blamed the church, because we did not do our job in raising their daughter. When you begin the study of chapter 10, you recognize he begins this chapter with a reminder. And he starts out, as you can see, I do not want you to be what?
Unaware.
In the NASB here, it says that I do not want you to be unaware. But I think the King James is much clearer. It says, I don't want you to be ignorant.
Yeah.
I don't want you to be, and now that's not saying I don't want you to be stupid. It's saying I don't want you to be unaware. I do not want you to ignore. I don't want you to be without knowledge of the fact that spiritual privilege, let's read it. For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and I love this, and the rock was Christ. Now, in this passage, Paul hearkens us back to the Old Testament stories that appear, that you've read over and over and over again in book of Exodus and Numbers. By the way, I've been praying about possibly doing a series on Numbers. I don't know if I've ever heard of anyone doing it. And I'm just stupid enough to want to try. But anyway, he referenced back to those stories, and he says, and he talks about their spiritual privileges. They were all under the cloud. And you understand what that is. In other words, as a nation, they moved from place to place, and there was always this beautiful, beautiful visual cloud, fire by night, and cloud by day, that led them on their way. They had this spiritual leadership, very, very visible. Wouldn't it be nice if you had a little cloud saying, go this way, no, don't go this way, and I would stop stumbling into a whole lot of things if I had one of those. So wherever they needed to go, God was leading them with the cloud. And they had supernatural guidance. By the way, so do we, not quite as visible, but when we're attuned, when we're alert, when we're discerning, we have that spiritual guidance. 98% appears here, by the way, of 97 or 99, whatever that is, but appears here. So many people have talked to me over the years that I need God's guidance. So do I. It's here, It doesn't tell you whether you should be a rocket scientist or not, but if you're obeying this much, you'll find out whether you need to be a rocket scientist or not. But anyway, number 2, he said they had the protection of God. Not only did they have the privilege of guidance, but they also had the wonderful protection of God. Verse 1 says they all passed through the sea. And all of us who have ever watched Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments, and know exactly what he's talking about and what that looked like. We have in our minds the image of the scene where God parted the seas, and so that about 2 million plus Israelites and camp followers went across on what I like, went across on dry land. By the way, I don't know what dry land is around my house nowadays.
Yep.
We've had so much rain we're so under the floodplain, I think. But anyway, they passed on dry land, and as the Egyptians watched, you remember what happened to them? They thought they could do the same, but it didn't work out that way. The Israelis passed through the sea and were safely on the other side. The Egyptian forces had a touch of water on them. Paul is saying that all of God's people back then not only had God's supernatural guidance, which is phenomenal in and of itself, with the cloud. But they also had the supernatural protection as they were going along, following God's guidance, in God's plan, and perfect with God's will. So they had that. The third privilege that they had, whoops, don't do that. They were identified with a person of blessing. It says they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now, I think you know, but I'll just reiterate anyway. Whenever you see the word baptized, because many times that means something other than what we normally think about. The basic idea of the Greek noun, baptizo, is to be identified with someone or something, but to be identified with someone, or be associated with someone. Now, in their case, Moses was God's choice servant. He was the leader of the God-appointed leader of the nation, and he was a man of God's blessings. And all of the people of Israel, as they were identified with Moses in the cloud and in the sea, received God's wonderful blessing in their lives because Moses was God's leader, and they followed him. Okay? So they were associated. God was blessing Moses, and because they obediently followed Moses, they were blessed. And yes, ma'am.
And my commentary says they were joined with Moses, which
Yeah.
gives you a good picture. If you're joined with a group or with a person, then you are part of the blessing.
Sure,
that they
good,
get.
good use, good interpretation of that. So the fourth thing that they mentioned, they had the provision of miraculous food. All of them ate, verse 3, all of them ate the same spiritual food and all drank of the same spiritual drink. You remember the stories from Old Testament, no doubt you understand God miraculously provides food for the Israelites. And they grumble and complain about it anyway, but they did. You know, sometimes just falling out of heaven. There were quail coming off the sea. I know it was quail because Bill told me that it was. So it was quail. As opposed to
Tastes a lot like chicken.
no, an awful lot like chicken, yeah. And they drank out of the solid rock. The water that came out, God brought provision, everything they needed physically from unlikely sources. Now think about this. Again, just to summarize, incredible spiritual provisions. They had guidance, they had protection, they had blessing, and material provision. What more could they want? What more could they need? They may have had other desires, but what more could they need? Now, isn't it interesting that in verse 4, they were drinking from the spiritual rock which followed them, and that rock was Christ. I want to park there just a minute. Somehow, Israel's Messiah, before he was born in human flesh, was accompanying them. Isn't that amazing? We don't think about that very much. I think that's absolutely incredible. And he, their Messiah, in a pre-birth incarnation, if you will, was providing for them in a cloaked but very real presence with them. He was the source of their water because why? He is the living water. He is the source of their bread because he is the bread of life. He was the source of their blessing because by him all nations are blessed. And he was the source of their guidance because he is the way, the truth, and the life. So he was the source of everything, and it was true then, and it's true now. The same thing for you and I. Now, the Apostle Paul outlines all of these incredible privileges, and his audience is reading this, and they're saying, yes, that's right. They had all of these things. And now, focus. And yet surprisingly, that wonderful set of spiritual privileges resulted in nothing but personal spiritual disaster. All of his blessings, all of this spiritual privilege, all of this provision by God, and it resulted in personal spiritual disaster. Verse 5. Nevertheless, all of that going on before, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Understand the point. We tend to think that spiritual privileges and comforts and provision will somehow guarantee for us spiritual success. I'm raised in that environment. Somehow I will, in spite of my spiritual state and my spiritual state of discernment of those things that are spiritually important, that I will just absorb all of this. I'm going to be totally candid. I wish I understood this spiritual truth when I was raising my family. I didn't. I worked hard to provide everything for them. Didn't always stick, because there needs to be that personal spiritual discernment of that which is important around them. Paul lists 3 privileges that he says, but then he says, but they ended in disaster. In verse 5, notice the words were laid low. It comes from the Greek root katastromi. What does that sound like to you?
Catastrophe.
Catastrophe. Exactly right. Exactly right. There was a catastrophe in the wilderness, even in spite of all of the privileges. God leading you every single day visibly and providing for you. I'm hungry, God. Have a quail. They pay $35 a plate for quail. So there was this catastrophe in spite of all of the spiritual privileges. And to understand what Paul had in mind here, it's imperative that I think that we only have time to just start it, but that we take a look back into chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Numbers. And in Numbers chapter 13 and 14, you'll find an incredible story of faithlessness after privilege. Faithlessness after privilege. And you remember, of course, that we've just seen that Israel was guided by the cloud, protected through the sea, identified and blessed in Moses, and they were eating and drinking from God's miraculous provision. God, in fact, by these 2 chapters in the narrative, have given them, at this point, have given them their laws and have provided for them a national constitution, if you will. And they were now a powerful nation and provided for a nation. And they were brought right up to the crust, if you will, of this beautiful land that God had been promising. And by the way, all of Israel doesn't look like that, but some does. That God was promising to them and their forefathers for 500 years. God had been saying, you're going to get this, you're going to get this. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give it to your sons. And so here they are standing on the border on the edge of the land of Canaan. You know the story. You've heard it preached and seen it in the movies. which is far more telling, over and over again. So they're looking there on the edge, and God tells Moses in so many words, y'all want a sneak peek of your Christmas present? And so I want you to go send some agents, you can call them spies if you want to, into the land and bring back some of its fruit and give a testimony of all that God is going to provide for you. It's a land flowing with
Milk and honey.
milk and honey, okay? And so Numbers 25, Numbers chapter 13, verse 25. And when they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Now, they've probably been collecting stuff for 40 days. They probably had cartloads of stuff to tell. And in verse 27, you'll see, thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there, and Amalek is living in the land of Neb, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites, makes you want to dance, doesn't it? The Hittites are living by the sea and by the Jordan. Now, we can't go in there. You've heard the story over and over again. Can't go in there. Yeah, there's tons of good provision, but the place is crawling with big guys. And unsaid, but by the way, God, these big guys are bigger than you. Right? This isn't as comfortable as we thought it would be. You know, it's like saying there's alligators in the lakes in Disney World. You know, we just can't, we can't go in there. So, I'm gonna have to stop there.